Early in the last century, my forebears lived here in middle-class respectability in the city of Cork. It was a world dominated by the British Empire, and Cork was a thriving garrison city. My great-grandfather was a sergeant in the Royal Irish Constabulary. But his service records are not kept in Cork. They're here at the National Archives in Kew. Here he is, 40739, Hassett Patrick, 5'10", same height as myself, from County Clare. In his mind, there was nothing unusual about him being sent, as we can see here, to serve in Belfast, because it was all one Ireland at the time. And he wouldn't have seen any contradiction between supporting the monarchy, but also supporting the idea of home rule for Ireland. Because remember, if home rule was granted, the country was still going to stay within the British Empire. And that empire really framed the world in which my great-grandfather grew up and in which he lived. Yet the image of a serene Ireland was deceptive. An Irish Catholic would never rise to the top of the RIC. In Her Majesty's civil service, Catholics were noticeably absent from the more senior posts. The Act of Union had given Catholics economic power, but their political destiny remained in the hands of London. As the century turned, a view of an Irish future utterly separate from Britain was finding expression in cultural revival. One of the many artists attempting to forge a new national consciousness was the poet and playwright William Butler Yeats. In 1903, with Lady Augusta Gregory, he founded the Abbey Theatre. It would see the production of their play Kathleen Ní Húlaháin, which represented Ireland as a beautiful woman for whom young men would sacrifice their lives. "They shall be alive forever," Yeats wrote. Later he would ask, "Did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot?" The cultural revival in sports, literature, theatre was profoundly influenced by the fear that Ireland was becoming British.
There's a fear that Ireland is losing its identity. That if a new generation does not embrace identity and national sentiment and the national language and so on, that something is going to be lost, irretrievably lost.
What was being written and talked about here in Dublin chimed with nationalist sentiments across the world. In 1911, Sun Yat-sen had declared his revolution in China. The following year, the African National Congress was founded in South Africa. And closer, in the Balkans, Serbian plotters were preparing acts that would change the world. Here, in Ireland, the long dominance of those who'd advocated change through peaceful means was about to be challenged.
Across Europe, there are premonitions of a cataclysm that will make a new world. In Ireland, a poet and teacher declared bloodshed a cleansing and sanctifying thing. Inspired by Christ and the warriors of Gaelic myth, Patrick Pearse had come to idealise martyrdom. Pearse was the son of an English father and an Irish mother. At St Enda's, his school outside Dublin, he declared it his mission to counter what he called the murder machine of British education. Pearse told his pupils to be ready to work hard for the fatherland, and if necessary, to die for it. Pearse joined the Irish Republican Brotherhood, committed to the overthrow of imperial rule. His alienation from the bourgeois world of his childhood would deepen when he watched the combined forces of state power and a Catholic-led business elite suppress the 1913 strike in Dublin. But the conditions in which Patrick Pearse and other radicals would rebel were created by the British government's attempts at reform. In 1912, the Liberal cabinet moved to introduce Home Rule. But in keeping a promise to Irish Catholics, it provoked the anger of Ulster Protestants.
Home Rule was seen as an attempt to undo the plantation of Ulster. It was seen as an attempt to bring the hewers of wood and the drawers of water, to bring them top, to effect a social revolution that would have seen Protestant Ulster, the Ulster that they had built, destroyed.
Protestant opposition was led by a man misrepresented as much by his allies as his enemies. Edward Carson was a Dublin lawyer who to this day remains the great icon of Ulster loyalism. Carson had been a fierce cross-examiner of his old college friend Oscar Wilde during a libel trial in which the writer denied his homosexuality. But this man, appropriated as an implacable Ulster Unionist, began with a very different agenda.
Most Irish people would regard Carson as the arch partitionist, but that's not what Carson is about. Carson is about sustaining the union between Great Britain and all of Ireland, not just the northeastern corner. And he wants to make that union work for the benefit of all Irish people.
But Carson understood that only in Ulster was there a Protestant population large enough to mobilise against Home Rule. On September 28, 1912, here in Belfast City Hall, Edward Carson signed a solemn covenant pledging to defend Ulster from Home Rule. Almost 250,000 men followed his example. But how were they going to back up this declaration with deeds? The Ulster Unionist leadership now made a momentous decision. The Ulster Volunteer Force, formed in 1913, directly challenged the state. It was encouraged in its threats of rebellion by British Conservatives, yet the government took no action. Nationalists reacted by founding the Irish Volunteers to protect Home Rule. They were joined by the Irish Citizen Army, led by James Connolly, a Glasgow-born socialist who'd come to prominence in the 1913 strike in Dublin.
When this paramilitarisation develops in the north, the reaction in nationalist Ireland is excitement. It's not fear. It's not a sense that a civil war may happen. This is what Irishmen should do. Time and again you hear it said, famously by Patrick Pearse, that to see arms in the hands of Irishmen is an ennobling thing, even if they're in the hands of Ulster Unionist Irishmen.
It was, of course, a grand delusion. Both nationalists and the British government seem to have forgotten the bitter struggles with loyalists over Home Rule in the previous century. It was as if they believed Ulster Protestants would eventually peacefully come round to the idea.
But the loyalists were busy arming themselves to fight whoever tried to impose Home Rule. On the 24th and 25th of April 1914, 25,000 rifles and 3 million rounds of ammunition were brought in through Larne and other ports and distributed across Ulster. These were German weapons being imported at a time of mounting international tension. It would be hard to imagine a greater challenge to the authority of the state. And yet the government did nothing. But when nationalists imported guns the following July, they were confronted. This double standard helped to radicalise many more moderate nationalists. Tension steadily escalated, until Ireland's quarrel was suddenly interrupted.
During the First World War, you get a sea change in the nature of Irish political opinion. People who had been thinking that constitutional methods would work changed their mind and felt that they wouldn't. People who felt that a more moderate goal was legitimate changed their minds and wanted something more radical.
The war would claim the lives of as many as 30,000 Irishmen. More than 200,000 served. To the moderate Irish nationalist leader John Redmond, the war was a chance to make the case to Unionists for home rule. Catholics would show their loyalty to the Empire. But as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, fears grew that Britain would introduce conscription in Ireland.
Redmond's call to arms looked increasingly to have been a serious political mistake. There was growing disillusionment among nationalists, but Ireland wasn't seething with anti-British fervour. It would take the events of Easter in 1916 to create the cataclysm.
As Britain floundered on the Western Front, a small group of plotters gathered in Dublin. They were a minority even within the revolutionary Republican Brotherhood. They included poets and hardened rebels. Pearse, who dreamed of blood sacrifice, and the champion of a workers' republic, James Connolly. They plotted the downfall of empire in Ireland, here above the tobacco shop of the veteran IRB man, Tom Clark. The rebels decided to move on Easter Sunday, date of Christ's resurrection. But the orders were countermanded by moderates. In the chaos of order and counter-order, Pearse, Connolly and the other radicals made a fateful decision. They would strike with a drastically reduced force in Dublin on Easter Monday, 1916. A detachment of Connolly's citizen army attacked Dublin Castle, symbol and seat of British power, but were repulsed. The main body of rebels, led by Pearse and Connolly, rushed down Sackville Street and took over the General Post Office. They raised the Irish tricolour above the building. Pearse stepped outside and read from a proclamation signed by himself and the 6 other leaders. He declared an Irish Republic. In the name of God and the dead generations, Ireland through us summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom.
A witness watching from a balcony opposite described how boys quickly gathered up any copies of the proclamation they could find, because, as he put it, they would be worth a fiver when the beggars were hanged.
The British were caught unawares, but by the end of the week they outnumbered the rebels by 10-1. From the River Liffey, a gunboat fired. Irish regiments also fought the rebels.
The Royal Dublin Fusiliers, who were drawn principally from the working class districts of the city, were being rushed up along the quays here to join the battle near the GPO.